Is intermittent fasting genuinely better for fat loss than just eating in a deficit? Or is it just another diet with a complicated name? That's what we're going to explore today, and that's the answers I'm going to try and give you. Now, it may be worth noting that I fasted for probably the best part of a decade, and my approach was simply just missing out breakfast. Of all the meals of the day, it's the one that we need the least, especially if our evening meal is generally got plenty of proteins, good carbohydrates, plenty of nutrients from vegetables. Through the night, everything restores, re-energizes, and you wake up fresh as a daisy. You're at 100%. So you don't really need your breakfast. So for me, it was the obvious choice of the meal to miss. I would then push the window back. So I'd probably have my first meal somewhere around 1, 2 o'clock. And then I'd eat again at kind of 6 o'clock-ish. And then I would have a bit of a snack later on. Now, for me, I found that approach worked. I generally ate and consumed less calories because I wasn't having, let's say, 500 calories from having my breakfast. So when I was in a deficit, and in fact, regardless, it was just my normal dietary habit to just not have breakfast. But when I was in fat loss as well, I then really only had to think about 2 meals of the day to spread these calories across, and then maybe some snacks in between. So as a tool, it worked very well for me personally. But today is just about exploring a little bit deeper, coming up with some actual facts from actual research and studies, and to offer a open-minded discussion around intermittent fasting, and ultimately leave you to make your own decision whether it's an approach that would work for you. So what is intermittent fasting? So there's lots of different approaches you can take. Something like a 16-8, for example, is very popular. It's where you fast for 16 hours and you have an 8-hour window where you can eat. Another approach might be the 5-2, which is where you eat normally for 5 days and then fast quite aggressively for 2. There's the 4-3, where you eat normally for 4 days and fast quite aggressively for 3. There's alternate day fasting, so you eat normally, then don't eat anything, then eat normally, then don't eat anything. And then there's something like OMAD, which is eat 1 meal a day. OMAD, 1 meal a day. But there's lots of different variations, lots of different versions of it. And they all have their own nuances, if you like. And the research on each of these shows different outcomes. So finding the one that would work best for you will become a more educated choice by the time you've finished the end of this video. So what the science actually says. So this is where it gets interesting and where I'm going to be straight with you rather than telling you what you want to hear. The biggest and most talked about research or study within this space of intermittent fasting was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they took 2 groups and split them. One group did time-restricted eating, so intermittent fasting, and the other group did a standard deficit, calorie deficit over the course of a day. So the other group were intermittent fasting. They were only allowed to eat between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. The other group were in the same caloric deficit, but could eat throughout the day. So they were matched on the number of calories they could consume. The only differing factor was one was allowed to eat throughout the course of a day with no limit. The other ones had a specific eating window, if you like. And the results showed no significant difference between the 2 groups. So there was no meaningful advantage from being in a fasted state for an extended period of time and only having a short eating window. And that finding rattled the intermittent fasting community a little. But then in 2025, the picture changed a little bit. And this new research added a rather specific nuance. So a randomised controlled trial looked at the 4-3 intermittent fasting, which is where you fast for 3 days and you eat only 20% of your normal caloric intake. And when compared to people in a normal standard calorie deficit, after a 12-month period, those that were on the 4-3 intermittent fasting approach lost on average 3 kilos more than those just in a caloric deficit for 12 months. And it was Harvard Health who covered this trial and this research and summarized that the 4-3 approach was simpler to follow than counting calories every single day. And that adherence might have been the cause for the increased weight loss. And in another meta-analysis, another nuance and a different approach, which was the alternate day fasting approach, was the only fasting strategy that consistently outperformed just being in a caloric deficit. Whereas the popular 16-8 approach didn't outperform at all. And results were much the same. And then this month, in July of 2026, a study from Adelaide University, which has just been published, found that intermittent fasting helped people lose as much weight as those who were in a caloric deficit, but without that overwhelming feeling of constantly controlling their food intake. So the researchers have said that the difference in the psychological burden of fasting could make it more sustainable for people. So to summarize, 16-8 can help you lose fat, but there's nothing particularly magical about it. It just encourages a caloric deficit by reducing your eating window. More aggressive fasting approaches like the 4-3 or alternate fasting may produce modestly better outcomes, but likely just because they create a bigger caloric deficit. Intermittent fasting may have a genuine edge on insulin sensitivity that goes beyond the calorie deficit, but that research is still developing. So we can keep an eye out for that one. But ultimately, the best strategy for fat loss is the one you're going to stick to. And for some people, intermittent fasting is genuinely easier to adhere to than daily calorie counting. So the case for intermittent fasting. Here's what intermittent fasting genuinely has going for it. It simplifies decision making. Rather than tracking calories, you just don't eat outside of a specific window, so it can help reduce your total caloric intake. So for those that find counting calories can become quite overwhelming or quite obsessive, then it could arguably hold a place. It can reduce total caloric intake without restriction, because people will generally eat less when giving a shorter space of time in order to consume. So for someone that generally grazes or snacks throughout the course of a day, to have a specific window in place can remove all of these additional calories consumed through often mindless snacking. There are benefits beyond fat loss, one of them being improving that insulin sensitivity. So it can lower your blood glucose, lower your blood pressure, and reduce triglycerides. It can also reduce inflammatory markers. A meta-analysis done in 2025 found significant improvements in all of those areas. So there are real health benefits above and beyond fat loss alone. There's also some emerging research on the impact of intermittent fasting on gut health. But this is an area that's still being explored, but genuinely interesting that the outcome of intermittent fasting may improve your gut health. So watch this space, I suppose, or watch that space, wherever the space is, where you'll find out more information on the impact of intermittent fasting on gut health. Maybe something I cover in the future. And lastly, it works for some people just on a psychological level. they find it quite freeing that without having to constantly weigh and measure and count calories, that it can be quite freeing just to say, right, I'm going to eat between 12 and 8, for example. And that's my 8-hour window. Or you could have a shorter window and do an 18-6 where you only eat between 1 and 7. And it can just be quite freeing that you can still be in a caloric deficit without the genuine ball ache of counting calories and measuring everything you eat. Now we're going to talk about intermittent fasting and everything that the hardcore fasting community don't really want to share. Muscle loss. And this is a big one. A study in 2025 found that people that were doing intermittent fasting lost muscle mass. And this is generally due to a decreased amount of protein synthesis. So the opportunity for your body and your muscles to absorb the proteins to make them stronger and healthier and repair. Because you're eating fewer meals. Because research shows that spreading your protein out between 3 or 4 meals throughout a day stimulates this protein synthesis and helps to develop lean mass more than having a larger amount of protein with less frequency. So if you're training and you are trying to maintain or improve your muscle mass, then intermittent fasting is potentially not the right place to be, because we need that protein synthesis to take place in order to develop lean mass, and it's not going to happen in fewer meals throughout a day. Intermittent fasting also doesn't work for everyone. Those that have potentially had disordered eating or eating disorders, which are two separate things, shift workers, people with blood sugar regulation issues, or those with really demanding physical jobs. Strict fasting windows can actually create more problems than they actually solve. Hunger, irritability, difficulty in concentrating, disrupted sleep, binge eating when given the window of opportunity, and can also cause hormonal disruption in women. Reported side effects that just don't get enough press. It's not magic, it's still about eating in a deficit. The New England Journal of Medicine made this very clear in their recent treaty study, that there was no significant difference between those intermittent fasting and those in a calorie deficit eating the same amount of calories. So there was no increased fat loss from either group. It was matched. So fasting isn't like some kind of superpower. The only way you actually lose fat, whether it's in a caloric deficit or intermittent fasting, is by eating less than you consume. And intermittent fasting can offer a more flexible approach for some people. But there is always still going to be a risk that if you eat more than you consume, regardless if that's in a 1-hour eating window or a 12-hour eating window, you still won't lose fat. And lastly, adherence can drop off. As with anything, any new kind of dietary approach will lose its appeal the longer you do it for. Now, like I say, I did it for about 10 years and it was second nature to me, but I don't now. I eat 3 to 4 times a day now because, well, just because I do. I don't really know why. I just kind of stopped with the fasting. I really enjoy my breakfast now. And having such a rigid eating window can also be really hard to stick to when you start thinking about the shift work thing, or even just your social life, like going out on an evening and having a meal, but you've got to have it before 8 p.m. because that's when your closing window shuts, or even 6 p.m. So in its own right, it can have restrictions. So adherence can then start to drop off. So where does that leave us? Intermittent fasting is a tool, a legitimate, well-researched tool that can work for many people, but conversely can also not work for equally as many people. It's not a miracle. It's not magic. And you'll hear some terminology like autophagy, which is just regeneration of cells, and ketosis, which is just about using your ketones. And again, all of these things happen regardless, because believe it or not, you fast every day anyway when you're asleep. So you're fasting for at least 8 hours, depending on how much you sleep, obviously. But let's say you were sleeping for 8 hours, you're already fasting. And all of this other miracle terminology that steadfast fasters will talk about happens naturally anyway. It can just be slightly heightened in a prolonged fasted state, but there is nothing unique to being fasted. And it might work for you. If you're not a big breakfast person, then skip it. Make sure you have a really well-informed, nutrient-dense lunch and evening meal. If you find calorie counting really stressful, I've used it with a couple of clients, and actually they found that progression with their weight loss was continued, but the freedom of not being or not having to count calories was freeing, and it worked for them. I've got others where they need to log every single thing because they need that rigidity and they need that ongoing accountability. If you find that you're a big snacker, especially late in the evenings, having a specific eating window can help curb that. It stops you from eating. Obviously, it still comes down to being disciplined, but having a specific window where you're allowed to eat can reduce this mindless snacking that can occur and this grazing that can occur throughout the day. And if you're not doing a significant amount of resistance training and the side effect of losing muscle mass holds no concerns for you, then it also might be a viable approach. But we all know the benefits of strength training. We also know the benefits of having as much lean muscle mass as we've got. So if that was a reason for you to choose fasting, the only reason, I would urge you to reconsider, because we need our lean muscle mass and we don't want it to be wasted because we aren't allowing for that protein synthesis to occur. Whether you do intermittent fasting or not, it's being in the caloric deficit that ultimately is the main driver for the fat loss. Intermittent fasting in its own right will not cause fat loss. What it can do is encourage you to consume less calories. And if that naturally puts you into a deficit, then you will start to lose fat. But there's nothing particularly magical about intermittent fasting that will accelerate your fat loss. It can just make creating a deficit simpler, but used as a tool alongside making sure you're sleeping enough, making sure you're drinking enough, making sure you are doing resistance training, making sure you're moving enough throughout the day and keeping your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis up, making sure you're consuming enough proteins. Alongside all of that, it can be a very useful tool that I have not only practiced myself, but have encouraged my own clients to adopt. So, is intermittent fasting worth trying? It's very individual. If it suits your lifestyle, it may be a fabulous approach to take. If you're a shift worker that's training to build lean muscle mass and you have a history of disordered eating, then I would urge you not to take on intermittent fasting. So it's so very specific and individual. So is it better than consistently eating in a calorie deficit over a prolonged period of time to achieve fat loss? There is no meaningful advantage of intermittent fasting above calorie counting when in the pursuit of fat loss. So stop looking for the thing that will make fat loss simpler and trying to make it inevitably then more complicated. The fundamentals are boring, but they work. They just require patience and consistency. So that's my summary and educated and informed and research-backed conversation around intermittent fasting, my own experiences, my clients' experiences, and some things for you to consider. It's been fabulous talking to you. Don't forget to subscribe, tell a friend, and I will speak to you all again next week.